Welcome to the Shared Value Initiative 2020 Speaker Series, Resilience Reimagined. I'm Bobby Silton, Managing Director of the Shared Value Initiative, and I'll be your host for today. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Shared Value Initiative, we are a global platform for leaders seeking business solutions to societal challenges. We are part of FSG, a not-for-profit social impact consulting firm that was co-founded by Professor Michael Porter of Harvard Business School and Mark Kramer. In a typical year, our initiative would be gathering people in person, but due to COVID-19, we've gone to a completely virtual platform, and we wanted to make these messages open to the general public. So we're really glad that you are with us today. A few housekeeping things before we get started with the programming. First of all, we are all broadcasting or webcasting from our homes, so we apologize in advance for any technical difficulties. Secondly, when you entered the room, you were put on mute and your webcam has been disabled. We will have a Q&A session at the back end of the programming, so please submit your questions using the Q&A function. And if you are on social media, if you could use these hashtags and handles so that we can follow the conversation. So today's event is actually the first of this series where we're going to be featuring over the course of the year purpose-driven leaders who are going to share their latest thinking with all of us. And over the course of the series, we will explore what Resilience Reimagined means in a variety of contexts and industries to rebuild systems that are more adaptable, sustainable, and equitable. We believe now, more than ever before, it's important for us to hear and learn from experts about what it means to drive change. So originally, today's talk was focused solely on Professor Rebecca Henderson's new book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And she was going to be in conversation with Mark Kramer. However, we recognize that we really can't have a conversation on reimagining capitalism without discussing the racial and economic inequities that it has existed in our society and have brought into focus with COVID-19 and the ongoing violence against the Black community in the United States. We must examine what role capitalism plays in supporting an unfair system, and how companies and their leaders can be a part of the solution. So after talking with Rebecca and Mark, we decided that we really needed an additional voice in today's conversation, and we are so fortunate to have with us an equity expert, Angela Glover-Blackwell of PolicyLink. While this conversation today may be informed by the current issues happening in the United States, we do recognize we have a global audience, and we think that what we will be covering today will be relevant, as I think this audience is collectively seeking a way that business can create a more just and equitable society. So now let me introduce our three speakers for today. First, Rebecca Henderson, professor at Harvard Business School. She's the John and Natty McArthur University Professor at Harvard University, and she teaches Reimagining Capitalism at Harvard Business School, one of its more popular classes. She's an advisor to some of the world's leading companies, and she also is a director on corporate boards. She is a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and we're delighted to have her here today. Angela Glover-Blackwell, she is founder in residence of PolicyLink, a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. Angela has helped to grow and advance the national equity movement in the United States by innovating and improving public policy to ensure access and opportunity to all low-income people and communities of color. She's a lawyer by training, and she recently launched a podcast called Radical Imagination. She sits on numerous boards, including FSG's board of directors. And last but not least, Mark Kramer. I mentioned that he is the co-founder of FSG. He is also a managing director of the organization. He co-authored the seminal article, Creating Shared Value with Michael Porter in HBS in 2011. Mark is also a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School, where he teaches creating shared value to MBA students, as well as through the executive education program. And he continues to bring new thinking to the shared value movement. And finally, Mark recently wrote a review of Rebecca Henderson's book in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So that's our lineup for today. And now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Rebecca Henderson, and I'll rejoin you during the Q&A session. So Rebecca, over to you.
Rebecca, we can't hear you.
Thank you, Bobby, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today. I don't know about you, but I find myself waking up at 4 in the morning worrying about what's happening, worrying about whether I'm doing enough, what will happen to the US and to our world. It's a very difficult time. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I think capitalism can be reimagined. I teach a 28-session course at the Harvard Business School on this, and I've just written a nearly 300-page book. And I'm going to try and summarize it in 10 minutes because I'm absolutely delighted that Angela can join us for this conversation. And I want to leave time for questions and discussion and for all of us to talk about how we move forward. But let me very briefly give you a sense of the situation as I see it and one plausible route forward. So, I am a down-to-the-bone capitalist. I teach at the Harvard Business School. I think capitalism is one of the great inventions of the human race, an unparalleled source of innovation, productivity, and opportunity. I don't think we're going to solve the problems that we face without it. But we have problems. We are failing to deal with the climate crisis that continues to move inexorably towards us. We have failed to address fundamental issues of inequality and exclusion in our society. I recently found out that 25 hedge managers make more money than all the kindergarten teachers in the US put together. I mean, whoa. And, you know, inequality is a feature, not a bug of capitalism. I don't have a problem with entrepreneurs making a lot of money and reaping returns. But when it's accompanied by pulling up the ladder of opportunity, when social mobility starts to fall, half the families in this country are not going to do better than their parents. When we see, as we are in this current epidemic, that many people, far too many people, do not have enough saved up that they can stay home if they're sick, that they have to keep working, even though they don't have sick pay. When we see that 50% of Black Americans and Brown Americans are financially struggling in the middle of the pandemic, and when, as this recent incident has shown us, that Black people in America are suffering from, which we always knew, may I say, but suffering from systematic oppression and exclusion, we have a problem. And we have the problem. We need to address what's happening. So, what do? At the largest level, how did we get into this mess? I think we got here because we forgot that a prosperous and thriving society is a stool with 3 legs. Yes, the free market, absolutely fantastic. But as well as the free market, a democratically elected, transparent, capable, accountable government, and a strong civil society, a society in which everyone can participate. You know, I love markets because they generate prosperity and freedom. But if we don't have a government that can set the guardrails around business, So that, for example, when I burn fossil fuels, I don't impose serious damage on the people around me and generations to come. A government that can ensure that education is equitable so that everyone has a chance to compete, that we have a healthcare system where people are not $400 away from disaster and healthcare bankruptcy is the major source of bankruptcy, and many people do not have access to healthcare. We have zip codes where life expectancy is lower than Botswana. So we need a society in balance. How do we get there? Well, no problem, okay? I'm joking. This is tough, but we are moving. I do not believe that business alone is the solution. I think we need major political and cultural movements. But I think rethinking the purpose of business can make an enormous difference. Let me give you a very quick sense of what I mean. Shared value is the starting place. Firms that have embraced a purpose in addition to maximizing profits, that are discovering the opportunities to build thriving, profitable businesses that address the problems we face, they are the foundation, in my view, for changing capitalism. Why? Well, they make a huge difference to the hundreds of thousands of people they employ, but they also act as catalysts. People like you show other firms what's possible, drive technologies down the learning curve, move entire industries forward. It's clearly not enough, but shared value is a fundamental starting place. What's the next step? The next step is collaboration. Firms coming together to say, for example, try this one. Let's all write letters to the mayors of the cities where we do business. Let us say, we have a plant in your city or a facility. In a few years, we're going to be reconsidering where we're located. We will relocate if you do not show us you are making systematic progress against issues of racism in your police force, if you do not show us that in your educational system we are affording access to everyone, if you do not have a plan for dealing with inequality and exclusion on the ground, we will rethink. And following that letter up by milestones and guidelines and working together, we're seeing these kinds of collaborations in food, in sustainable apparel, in deforestation. We know that firms can come together to make doing the right thing pre-competitive, to put the power of business behind really transforming our society. 2 more steps and then I'll stop. We need to rewire finance. ESG is an incredibly exciting development. Certainly lots of room to go, but investors must give purpose-driven firms the support and room they need to build these thriving business models. And very large investors, so-called universal investors, need to come together to acknowledge the reality that problems like climate change and inequality are not somebody else's problem. They are an integral threat to the long-term returns to the portfolio, as well as to our entire society and our planet. So investors can come together and support society and the firms in their portfolio in making these kinds of positive changes. And last but not least, we need to rebuild our democracy. We have a party that has forged an alliance between many business people and those who were not interested in addressing issues of race or exclusion. We need to make it very clear that business thrives when society thrives. And that's when democracy serves everyone. 70% of Americans think the political system is biased against them, is rigged. More than 56% of people worldwide say capitalism is not working for them. They say that because they feel shut out and excluded. As capitalists, we put our head down and make money, and I'm so with that. That's fine. But we need to remember that without a healthy society and a healthy system, we will not thrive. We need to lend our voices to those pushing for a truly balanced world. So in conclusion, we can save the world. Slowly, painfully. This work is hard, but it is the only work worth doing. Thank you for all the difference that you're making in the world.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I really appreciate those comments. I'll just add, it was a pleasure to have the chance to read your book and review it. Everyone watching can tell how passionately it is written. And I think there are so many books out there that are critical of capitalism. There are very few that are actually proposing solutions by people who understand business and can create a realistic path forward. And I think that is one of the great benefits of your book. So I definitely encourage people to go out and read it. It's well worth it. Let's bring in at this point Angela, who I've had the pleasure to work with for a number of years now. And it has been a real treat to learn from Angela. She is indeed an expert and thought leader in the area of racial equity. And also, I will say, has advised many major corporations on these issues as well. So, Angela, given where we are today and the comments that Rebecca has just made, what else do we need to bear in mind? What's the message that people need to hear?
Well, it is so important to answer the question, where are we today? Because today represents an extraordinary, truly extraordinary opportunity to be able to become different. Where we are today is very much defined by the protests that are happening across the country. And those protests represent what all protests represent, and that is multiple goals. Some people are really just wanting to see justice for George Floyd. Some people want to see that justice plus a reform of the policing system. Some want to go beyond that and see transformation of criminal justice and other systems that have been oppressive throughout the years, the decades. And what that really poses is an opportunity to respond to the George Floyd injustice and to be able to tack it right on top of the impact of COVID-19 and what we know will be the impact of the country trying to recover from the economic plight. This is a moment in which those people who are thoughtful have to come to grips with the thing that holds the nation back, but also holds business back. I'm sorry, but I'm hearing an echo. Is it okay to keep going forward?
You sound great to us.
Good. And in thinking about that, we have to understand that business has an exquisitely important interest in getting it right. Because not only is the nation in peril, but as the nation is in peril, businesses are in peril, and our economy is. That we live in a nation, sadly, that was founded on stolen land, genocide, and human bondage. And I always like to just pause for the briefest of seconds after I say that, because that's a hard truth to hear. But the worst part of it is that the narratives that justified it then continue the impact of that inequality right up to today. And it's a narrative of a hierarchy of human value, that some people are worth more than others. That's why our systems keep producing such unequal outcomes, because the educational systems don't expect all children to achieve at high levels, graduate, and go on and reach their full potential, only some. Our criminal justice systems did not expect to treat everybody properly and respectfully, but only some. Policing in this country began as a way to control and contain. Therefore, we have to understand that these systems will not change until we change the hierarchy of human value. And that cannot be done company by company. It can't be done business by business. It has to be done as a whole. And to reinforce what Rebecca was saying, though she didn't say it quite this way, but I heard it, that Corporations have hijacked democracy. They have outsized influence in society. They have replaced civil society's ability to be able to coerce and move government to act on behalf of the people. Therefore, businesses have an outsized responsibility right now to be able to step into this moment and create the kind of society that we need. That means that in addition to good business practices that encourage full inclusion and stop discrimination, that we also have to, as business leaders, step into the public policy realm, because it would be civil society that would be pushing government in this circumstance in a robust democracy. But we don't have a robust democracy anymore. So business, in addition to improving its practices so that it is doing the right thing, so that it has credibility to step into the public policy realm, has to begin to push for universal health care, for an educational system that works for all, for fair minimum wage, for paid sick leave, for child care, for elder care, and all of those things. The policy agenda does not need to be created, but we need new people to demand it. And this is a moment in which to do that.
Thank you very much, Angela, for those thoughts. And you know, who can argue? This is the truth we're living today. Rebecca, let me ask you, and you know, what we're talking about here sounds very radical, very progressive, but one of the perplexing things about the book as you've written is that taking these steps actually creates a healthier and more prosperous environment for business, as well as for our country and our economy. So if this is all things business should do to make more money, why aren't they doing it?
It does sound a little progressive in an American context. I think it's important to remember that in a global context, it is not. Many European countries have a strong safety net, much stronger policies for inclusion, a much stronger role for government. In the US, we find ourselves in a rather strange moment. Business spent the last 30 to 40 years saying we have no duty beyond shareholder value maximization, that was a moral duty for all kinds of good reasons. And I think many business people took for granted the functioning of a healthy society. Someone else would take care of education. Someone else would take care of healthcare. It's not my job. I'm just going to put my head down and make money. And that was individually rational. So individually, everyone did great. And to Angela's fabulous point, as it became easier to influence the political process after Citizens United was passed, what company could resist making money by trying to get the rules written in their own favor? I mean, something that is the royal road to crony capitalism and as far from real free market capitalism as I think any of us would get. But for each individual firm, it was rational. The issue we face now is how do we together say, whoa, this is going to a bad place? Because what I said about the three stools, that's not some commie tree-loving stuff, although I am a tree lover, not a commie. It's what we say to every country that's trying to build a strong capitalist system. We say you need inclusive institutions, you need justice, you need equal justice to the law, access to the law. We know that this is what drives a thriving society, but it's collective good. And so now we have to think about how do we move together? That's our problem. Individual firms can build credibility, can be lighthouses, but how do we move all of us? That's the issue.
That's a great response. Thank you. And Angela, you know, you've described a deeply embedded system of structural racism. No one can deny that is the case. But I have to say, for me personally, when we start to talk about such deeply embedded systems, I find it very hard to think about what I personally can do. What's your advice, particularly to people who have important roles in corporations, and not just in the US, but around the world?
I have a college-age granddaughter who came over to talk to me just yesterday because she was on a web class, because everything's on Zoom now, and something came up in a class in which she is the only Black student. And it was about what's going on now. And she spoke up forcefully. Someone else spoke up to offer a counter about how what was going on in the streets was just criminal and it was awful. And she spoke back forcefully, and no one supported her. She got emails afterwards from other students saying, text, I'm sure it was, or Instagram emails, that's old folk stuff, but she got some Instagram messages or texts. And then she was upset and she talked to me about it because no one supported her. And I said, send everybody, the whole class, and say, some of you supported what I said afterwards. I needed you to speak up in the moment. I appreciate that you supported it, but if you don't speak up in the moment, no one knows that I have any support. And then last night, she shared with me a ton of responses she was getting from everyone. That's what all of us can do individually. We can know that this is not a problem that Black people are going to solve in America, or that Latinx people or Native Americans. We all have to be in it. And the more white people begin to step forward, as they are on the streets now, and we're all inspired by it, I certainly know I am, everybody can do that. The next thing you can do is to be a leader where you are. Some people lament that at this moment, we don't have a single leader. We don't have a Martin Luther King Jr. who's in charge of all of this. And my response is, Dr. King was only using his leadership to get the powerful leaders in America to lead. And if we can jump over having one person who can be eliminated, embarrassed, dismissed, if we can jump over the single leader to all of the leaders, that is really what a movement is trying to do. That is how change happens. And so all of us, everybody who is listening today, we are all leaders, and we have to lead within the places where we have influence. And if you're in a place, you have influence. Being able to use that influence to raise these issues, to make suggestions, to pull together working groups, and to do what Rebecca just pointed out, that while we all want to solve racial oppression, all who want to solve it from a moral place. There is also a democratic and an economic and a business imperative to do so. In this nation, the future home buyers, the future consumers, the future innovators, the future workforce, they're going to be majority people of color. If we get the nation right so that people of color can thrive and participate and invent and lead, everybody benefits. In fact, that inclusion is the way forward. It is the way forward for real and sustainable progress. So each of us, everybody has the opportunity from their particular perch to lead, to show a new way, to pull others in. And I want to emphasize two things have to happen. We have to create models to show what it looks like, but we have to create models to have credibility when we do the thing that is essential, step onto the national stage and lay out what we need to do to tap the potential of everyone.
That's terrific. And Rebecca, I want to give you a chance to respond. I also have been struck by how many businesses have been tweeting out statements of support, quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, other inspiring words. But what concrete things in response to this moment should businesses be thinking about doing? You know, we're at a moment in time where all the earnings projections have gone out the window. We have no idea what this year is going to look like in terms of corporate earnings. And that ought to give a certain degree of freedom to return not to the normal we had before, but potentially to a new normal that is better.
Could I make a couple of suggestions, and then I'm super curious what Angela is going to say? So it looks as though it's CEOs who drive change, but it is not. It is employees and customers who really move large organizations. We need CEOs who pay attention and act, but they need employees and customers to insist. So as an employee, look around. What can the firm do? Many of the world's largest corporations are continuing to employ people at less than a living wage. That's not okay. I talk about the example of Mark Bertolini, who was CEO of Aetna, who found out by accident that 12% of his workforce were on minimum wage. Most of them were single mothers. Many of them had children, were on food stamps and on Medicaid. And he went back to his team and he said, we are going to fix this. We are going to pay them a living wage. And he also learned they couldn't afford the healthcare that the firm was selling. We are going to give them healthcare. He did that, 12% of his workforce. For many people, that was an increase of 30 or 40% in take-home compensation. And it cost him $20 million. It cost Aetna $20 million. That year, their net profit was in the order of 3 to 4 billion. It also bought him unbelievable employee engagement, focus. Who were those 12%? They were the people answering the phones. I mean, classic shared value. Here I am telling you about shared value, but look around where you work. These opportunities are very much there. Have the courage to push. So many firms, it begins with small groups inside the firm agitating to firm. So if your CEO has issued a statement, hold them to account. What are they going to do? And here are some ideas.
That's terrific. And I have to say, the most astonishing thing in what you just said is that the CEO found out by accident that 12% of his workforce were basically living and working in poverty. And of course,
they weren't tracking it. And
yeah,
when he went to his senior team, they said, we're paying prevailing wage. He said, I don't care.
Yeah. But one of the most challenging things about structural racism, about systemic change, is it's invisible to so many people who are in positions of leadership. Angela, how do we see the structural racism, the biases built deeply into all aspects of our system that many of us are, as indeed I had been for many, many years, oblivious to?
Well, the first thing you have to do is look and open your eyes and listen to the people who are not oblivious to it. What is so interesting is that every company has extraordinary experts within it, and that is the people of color who are suffering every day because they are not seen and they are not heard. Tap that expertise and ask. But to go back to your question about what corporations can do, they can certainly do what Rebecca said. They can pay living wages, but we need to know that part of the role of being an employer in this day and age is to begin to give a jump start to economic mobility and to rebuild America's middle class. That does not happen with part-time contract work. That happens with full-time employment. Employ people full-time. Make sure that they have the opportunity for advancement, the kind of training, the exposure. Create a culture of belonging. That is just so important. What people really feel first when they go into a company, even more than the low wages that they're getting and all of the other, is the outsiders not belonging, it not being for them, by them, or anything, a culture of belonging. Make sure that we understand family strife, that they need paid sick leave, but they also need paid family leave, and they need child care and all of those things. And the reason we want to do this is to be fair, to be able to have an employee set that you can count on into the future, but begin to rebuild the middle class. If people of color do not become the middle class, there will not be a middle class. That is a stark reality. The future of the nation is dependent on that consumer group, that innovative group. And so thinking about that, and in terms of public policy, just a quick story. My father, who was a teacher, also worked in the post office. And many of his colleagues who were teachers also worked in the post office, or they only worked in the post office. The post office, teaching in the public schools, the auto plants in Detroit, those are the things that made the Black middle class. The very things that, because of the economy, because of the way that we're viewing government, are under threat or have disappeared. We need for businesses to understand all three legs of the stool are important. They need to be strong and they need to function. We need public policy. But the reason that the post office and so many other government jobs were able to make the Black middle class is because they were the first to have to get rid of discrimination and to open up employment. We need for the corporations to do what they can to build the middle class. It is what families will need. It's what brings about community stability. It's what brings about safety. It's what brings about economic vitality. And so thinking about the employment practices that hire, target, promote, support, and create pathways for the kind of stability into a middle class lifestyle that people are looking for.
Fantastic. And you know, Rebecca, you've talked about in the book the importance of companies adopting and committing to a social purpose, to have the vision and courage to really make radical change, architectural change is the term you use. And you also say something very interesting toward the end, which is to ask the reader, have you found the purpose in your own life? Could you say a bit about that for people out there whose companies may espouse a purpose but may not yet live it, or for people themselves who may not yet have thought about what's the purpose of my own life?
Sometimes people ask me why I got involved in this work, and I have an official answer. I spent 20 years studying innovation, and this feels to me like the next great innovation. And I was actually the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management. I say this is our world's Kodak moment, and we have to grasp it and live through it. But in the book, I tell the real reason. And you're asking me to give away the end, but I will. For many years, I was married to a professor at Harvard, an astrophysicist. His name was John Huckra, and he was born on the wrong side of the tracks in New Jersey. He was the first in his family to go to college, and he became one of the world's great astronomers. He discovered something called Huckra's lens and something called the Great Wall of the Universe. He was a super big deal. And he was also one of the nicest men I know. Unbelievably loving, totally in love with our son, who was born when he was older, and he never thought he'd have a family. And he would get on a plane and fly to California to talk to a high school about why they should study science. And almost exactly 10 years ago, I came home from a business trip to find him lying on the floor. I thought he was playing with the cats. He was dead. He had passed away from a heart attack. And you know, I've been a Buddhist for most of my life, and I summarize Buddhism as good news and bad news. And the good news is we're not going to die. And the bad news is that's because we don't exist. I believed intellectually that we were just balls of electrons, just moments that came together. And I realized when John died, I hadn't really believed it emotionally. And I realized that John was a song the universe was singing. And that what we worry about day to day, I mean, of course we have to make a living, and for many people that's hard. But all this stuff about status and getting together ahead and what other people will think, it doesn't matter. What matters is living a life as full on and as committed as you can. And for people like us that have an opportunity to make a difference, that is the only thing to do. John is dead, but he gave his life to everything he cared about. And that's why I do this work. And I'm sorry, I'm breaking up.
Thank you for sharing that.
emotional.
I'm tearing up myself. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that. Angela, you know, I mentioned before, many of the people on this webinar are outside the US. What can they do to be of help and support in this moment?
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. I know that people are from outside of this country, and I also know that the essence of what we're talking about applies across the world. There's no country in which people aren't being left behind. And if we look carefully, there are characteristics of the people who've been left behind. And if you can look at the characteristics of a person and know or predict the likelihood that they or their children will be left behind, you have a systemic problem. And so I just want to encourage wherever you are to understand that, because there's a stand to be taken every place in the world. And for those of you who are still kind and generous enough to be focused on this country and how to make it better, being able to speak out about that, being able to see what perhaps people who are here every day do not see and to point it out, being able to join enthusiastically in being a learner and not assume that what you have known is the only reality there is, that we all need to be learners in this time, and doing what we've been talking about here, creating the model of building your credibility to be able to step on the broader stage and say, for all of us, for the nation, for the world to thrive, we have to be able to act differently. There can be no returning to normal. Normal was not good. We have an opportunity to move to a new place, and I'm thrilled that so many people are willing to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I know we're going to turn to questions from the audience, and Bobby's going to moderate that in about 20 or 30 seconds. Any last thought or comment?
No, just that I completely agree with Angela. This is not just a US issue. This is a huge issue for the world going forward. And I think unless we grapple with it, we will reap the whirlwind.
Bobby?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for an incredible conversation. I wish we had even more time today to discuss this, but we have a lot of terrific questions coming in the Q&A, and some of them you have answered during your conversation, but I'll start with this one. For companies to be sincere in living into their purpose, how can companies incorporate social metrics to report on positive impacts on society and keep themselves accountable?
Angela, shall I take that?
Oh, please, Rebecca.
I'd be very curious as to your cut. It's incredibly important to have measures of what we commit to. This is why the whole move to ESG is so important. At the moment, it can be very frustrating. Many ESG metrics are not very good, and many S metrics in particular are not great. But I'm reminded of the fact that in the 1930s, financial accounting didn't look so great either. That in the 1930s, when P&G published its annual report, it had two numbers in it: sales of about 30 million and profits about 500,000, and the line, stockholders wishing further information can apply to the headquarters in person in Cincinnati. So we are at the beginning stages of developing good metrics. There are a number of, I think, excellent initiatives, including SASB, which is looking at material non-public, how do we find material non-financial information? I will mention the work of my colleague, George Seraphim, who has founded the Impact Initiative at HBS. I'm sorry, I always forget the full title, and it's a fantastic effort. It's about really finding great metrics and showing that they have impact.
Impact-weighted accounting, I believe it is.
What is it, Mark? It's impact-weighted accounts. Thank you. Impact-weighted accounts is just fabulous. So there are a number of ways into this problem and a bunch of great research in the space, and I encourage you to really look at it.
And if I can just add, because FSG and the Shared Value Initiative has been working with a number of companies, and what I've seen as the sort of fundamental disconnect is the assumption people have that social and environmental things are things you do to be nice and have really nothing to do with the financial results of your business. And if you're making business decisions, don't worry about those soft things. And the most striking example we've just come across from a company we've been working with is Enel, which is the power company for Italy. And they have been shifting dramatically toward renewables and made a big deal about that as part of their commitment to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It turns out that renewable power is actually significantly more profitable than fossil fuel generation at this point. They've never said to their investors, as we move to renewables, we're going to make more money, because they thought the message was just for those people who care about sustainability and the SDGs, and they just never made that connection. And so the biggest challenge I find is the recognition that social and environmental issues are business issues with financial consequences. And business decisions have social and environmental consequences all the time. And we have to stop living in two separate worlds and come together in a single world that recognizes this interdependence.
It's material, financially relevant information, and we haven't been looking at it. Why would it not be useful to know what your turnover rate is, how much you invest in training, whether your employees feel engaged, what the major risks you're facing? I'm really optimistic on this front, Mark. I talk to a lot of investors who are beginning to see it as just another way to understand the performance of the firm.
It's a big mindset shift that we need to make. Angela, did you want to add anything to that before I go on to the next question?
Thanks, just a little bit, because I agree with everything that was said, and how important it is to measure how the process of change is going, as well as how the outcomes are. Big mistake that we've made in the social arena is to say that this is what we want to do, and then when we don't achieve it, to say what we did was a failure, without measuring what we did and how close it was to what we intended to do. That if you are trying to make these kind of changes, yes, they will produce good business results, but only if you do it well, which means you have to measure the performance of the employees based on how well they are making a shift to racial inclusion and understanding how to work in these new ways. So don't forget to measure that. And I also want to refer you to my colleague, Michael McAfee, who's the CEO at PolicyLink, who is working very hard to be able to capture the data and the measurements all along the way.
Wonderful, Angela, thank you so much. So here's a very interesting question. What's the difference between shared value and shared prosperity? Who wants to take that one?
Well,
Mark, you wrote the article.
Yes, so what many people don't appreciate is that when we're talking about creating shared value, we're not talking about corporate social responsibility. We're not talking about philanthropy. We're talking about a competitive strategy that enables you to differentiate your business from competitors by the positive social impact you have in the world, that enables you to lower costs and increase profitability by addressing the needs within your business and supply chain that are exactly the kind of needs we've been talking about, with underpaid employees and variable shifts that deny people a full week's work and embedded prejudices in the operations of the company. And it's about paying attention to the health and well-being of the communities in which your company operates. Because if you aren't addressing those things, you are finding that your training costs and turnover are much higher because our educational system is a failure, that your business model is in jeopardy because you haven't paid attention to environmental impacts. It's really about how you run your business. Now, shared prosperity, in my mind, is the result. It is what comes from creating shared value. That when we succeed, our customers succeed, our employees succeed, and our suppliers succeed. There's considerable talk today about this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And I've just been interviewing the leadership of PayPal and writing a Harvard teaching case about them. And one of the quotes that stuck with me is, if you don't pay attention to the well-being of any one stakeholder group, all the other stakeholder groups suffer. And that includes your shareholders. So if you aren't treating your employees properly, if you aren't giving them opportunities for advancement, paying wages, paying sick pay, maternity leave, all of the things that Angela mentioned and Rebecca mentioned, you're actually reducing the return and undercutting the resilience of your company.
Thank you, Mark. And I think one of the things that we really are learning from the COVID-19 pandemic is that we are more interconnected than we ever knew. And I think you've said this time and again, that we're inextricably linked. And without a healthy society, we cannot have a healthy platform for business. Angela, Rebecca, anything to add there? Would you like me to go on to the next question?
Go to the next question.
Okay, so this one is one about small business. So I think through COVID-19, we've I think, are learning more about the whole small business community. And the question is, how does this apply to small business in addition to large corporations?
Being a small business owner is tough. My mother was an entrepreneur her whole life and always struggling at the edge of profitability. So I'm viscerally aware of how constraining it can be. At the same time, small businesses are often ideally positioned to immediately reap the returns of treating people well. The phrase I use is a high road business model, treating people with dignity and respect, creating good jobs along the lines that Angela suggested, giving people the power to have some control over where they work, and a shared sense of meaning and belonging. That's a business model that's been out there forever. And we have really an enormous amount of research saying not that it will inevitably catapult you to the top of your industry, but that it will generate more productivity, more innovation, more commitment, and that you will certainly be able to survive. That it is not necessary to treat people badly in order to do well as a small business. If you'd like to learn more about some of this work, look at the Good Jobs Institute at MIT, where Zeynep Ton has shown, I think, very conclusively that in industries as diverse as convenience stores and grocery stores, she's particularly focused on retail, those firms that run this business model do really well. And if you're interested in the pointy-headed scholarly research behind some of that, check out my website at Harvard. Lots of evidence to suggest that that is a better way to run companies and certainly a way to make money. So every small business can think about that. And that feeds directly into this agenda that we've been talking about, because small businesses hold up half the sky, and they're where so much of the creativity and entrepreneurship really comes from, and new ways of doing stuff.
Angela, Mark, anything to you want to add there?
Well, I am so glad that Rebecca mentioned small businesses, because for any financial institutions that are listening, the discrimination against small business owners of color is a national scandal, disgrace, and such a tragedy, because there is so much innovation there. There's so much knowledge about what the communities that are going to be the future need, so much energy and so much desire. A known thing is that people who are Black, Latinx, and Asian are 3 times as likely as people who are white to start small businesses. And yet they have so little money, so little connection to the expertise and the financial support that they need. That really needs to be given a huge priority. We are on the edges of a conversation that ebbs and flows about reparations in America. If we ever step into reparations and begin to ask, what do we owe the people whose society is placed at such a disadvantage, being able to really help the entrepreneurial classes within the Black and other communities of color is an essential element. We need to really jump over the slow progress from where they are and figure out a way to put it on speed up, because we're missing all of that in the economy, and it's such a sad thing that people haven't been able to pursue their dreams and their innovation.
And I'll just add, we've been writing this case on PayPal, and they have developed a product called PayPal Working Capital, because large banks do not make loans to small businesses, and it is systemic racism, and it is also the fact that they're not set up to make small loans efficiently on a cost-effective basis. But with the technology we have today, it is very possible to make loans through the internet, cell phone basis, and particularly of help to small business. And PayPal has now been able to make $15 billion of loans to small businesses. 70% of them are women or people of color owned businesses. They are overwhelmingly in communities where banks have left and closed their branches after the 2008-2009 recession. It's a profitable business for PayPal. It's meeting an immense need. And under this recent payroll protection plan, they were able to get $1.5 billion out very quickly in loans where the average loan amount was $3,000. So it was really reaching the small businesses that needed that capital. There are solutions today that enable us to address these inequities that we didn't have 20 years ago. And we need to be aggressively pursuing these solutions, recognizing that there are markets, that there are products, that there are services that we can profitably deliver today that can overcome systemic racism consequences, that it's important for us to do, and that it is a real business opportunity for us to seize.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think PayPal is doing some very compelling work. So we have time for one last question, and it's a topic that we have already touched on very lightly in this Q&A, but because we do have a global audience, I just wanted to ask all of you if there's any additional words or examples that you'd like to share with our global audience about how they can take some of this thinking and bring it to the countries in which they are doing business in.
I'll do one quick thought, and then I'll let the more inspiring speakers take over to conclude. I was giving a talk just the day before yesterday to the Africa Shared Value Leadership Summit, a gathering of people in Rwanda, but from all across Africa. And the head of the African Union Commission had tweeted out a quote condemning the violence and unrest in America. And I was struck by thinking how rare it is that we get a message from Africa that is criticizing the US for violence and civil rights violations. And I think that we are not an island as much as we might try to believe we are. And I think that global political pressure matters. And I think that that will make a difference.
Rebecca, looks like you're trying to say something.
I don't want to cut Angela off. Angela, you go.
No, I already said what I wanted to say on this topic. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
I was going to go meta. I was going to say, let's remember the underlying problems we face are entirely global. That we have a massive environmental crisis. Wealth has become extremely concentrated almost everywhere. And that the steps we need to get out of this situation as a business community are also global. Doing what we can within our own companies, creating shared value where we are. Looking for collaboration in regions, in industries, making sure that doing the right thing is pre-competitive. Working with the investment community to be clear that this is good business. That's a mutually reinforcing link. And last but not least, being a strong partner for democratic and accountable government so that we build a balanced society where we have all the power of capitalism, but all the strength of a strong society and a strong polity as well. And that feels to me a completely global issue.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I just want to thank all of our speakers today, Rebecca Henderson, Angela Glover Blackwell, Mark Kramer. Thank you for this really engaging and timely conversation. I hope those of you in the audience get a chance to pick up Rebecca's book. It is very compelling. She did give a little bit away of what the ending was, but it's definitely worth a read. Please go to PolicyLink to learn more about equity in our society. There are lots of good resources, and also at fsg.org and sharedvalue.org. This recording will be made available on sharedvalue.org for all the people in the audience and who registered. We will be sharing out a link. For those of you who were lucky enough to sign up early, the first 300 registrants who also participated in the webinar will get an e-copy of Rebecca's book, so we will be sending out something to you next week with a link to download your copy. And I want to also just say a big thank you to the Shared Value Initiative team who's working behind the scenes. We apologize for some of the technical difficulties, but it's great that we were able to get the valuable thoughts of all of our speakers. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope to see you next time.